Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay, shall we get started?
Yes, we're recording now.
Perfect. So hi everybody, welcome to this meeting of the University of Oxford's Southernizing Criminology discussion group. I'm Lucy Harry, and today Louise Del Santo and I are delighted to have all of you joining us for Professor Biko Agozino's talk on African and counter-colonial perspectives in criminology. We'd also like to thank those of you who have been able to attend our previous events too. Just to provide you a bit of a background information on this initiative before we introduce today's speaker. We are a student-led group seeking to foster discussions on criminological issues beyond the so-called global north. We had our inaugural event with Professor Maximo Sozzo in February, and I believe he may be joining us today in the audience. And a fortnight ago, we hosted Professor Kerry Carrington. This term's series of events is focused on criminological contributions from different regions. So today we are very excited to have distinguished Professor Biko Agozino, who will talk about African and counter-colonial perspectives in criminology. And just to let you know, our following events this term will entail contributions and comments on the state of criminology in other geographical regions. So we will have scholars talking about the Balkans, Latin America, and also South Asia. And our events will be running until mid-June, taking place every other week. Please go to our website for more details and also to sign up for these events. We've also organised our term card for Michaelmas 2021, which will be starting in October. And this will focus on theoretical, methodological and philosophical tools to make sense of the reality of countries in what we would consider global peripheries. And we will release this term card in due course. Before Louise introduces today's speaker, I'm just going to run through a few Zoom practicalities. I'm sure you're all well versed on online meeting etiquette by now, but just to remind you, please may you mute yourself during Professor Agozino's talk. He'll present for roughly 30 minutes, and this will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A discussion. At this point, you may put your hands up or write your question in the chat box, and we'll call upon you to make your contribution. Professor Agozino's talk will be recorded and posted on the Centre for Criminology website after the event, but the discussion session will not be. I think that's everything from me, so I'll hand over to Louise now.
Okay, hello everyone. So to introduce today's speaker, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Biko Agozino, Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at Virginia Tech University. Professor Agozino is an award-winning academic. By way of examples, he was ranked among the top criminologists in the world by academicinfluence.com last year. He also won the Excellence in Outreach and International Affairs Award from the College of Liberal Arts and Human, as well as the Amistad Award from Central Connecticut State University. He was appointed as Professor Extraordinaris in Criminology at the University of South Africa. He's the editor-in-chief of the African Journal of Criminology and Justice Studies, also co-editor of Routledge Handbook of Africana Criminologists and co-author of Community Policing in Nigeria. He's also the author of books Black Women and the Criminal Justice System Towards the Decolonization of Victimization and Counter-Colonial Criminology, a critique of imperialist reason. So we are delighted to have you with us today, Dr. Agozino. So over to you.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you, Lucy, for inviting me to Oxford to speak. I am delighted because you and your colleagues have succeeded in making Oxford a lot more critical than it used to be. It used to be more of a conservative institutional approach to criminology. And I think you should be commended for helping to transform it and make it more responsive to innovations in scholarship. But I'd like to start by giving out a shout to Sizwe Mpofu Wash, and all the students who campaigned for Rhodes to fall. We were attacked earlier. Again, that is an honor because it's not usual to have an academic seminar being bombed and attacked by people who do not like to hear what we have to say. As we know, there are still people who are big fans of empire and colonization and white supremacy, who would feel threatened by something like Southernizing criminology and ending imperialism and colonialism. So it's not surprising that such people might want to attack and disrupt our discussion, but we invite them, we invite the opponents of decolonization to bring their arguments so that we can listen to their concerns and reassure them that decolonization is good for everybody, because empire colonialism is a threat to all, including poor whites, who are usually used as a cannon fodder for furthering the goals of imperialism and colonization, and who got killed in their millions defending king and country, or whatever else they fight for, God and country. So I like to go back to how I started by giving out a shout to students like Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, who led the campaign for Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford, at the same time that South African students were leading the campaign at the University of Cape Town to remove the insulting statue of the architect of apartheid, Cecil Rhodes, from the campus of the University of Cape Town, and they succeeded. So congratulations to the students. The campaign for Southernizing criminology or decolonizing criminology is not simply an academic exercise. It is a practical struggle out there on the streets to say to the world that Black Lives Matter, and to remind everyone that white supremacy is a threat to all, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as Martin Luther King Jr. put it. So I commend the students and faculty members at Oxford and other universities that spoke at Cambridge, and the story is the same. This push is being led by young students, and we are very proud of you. But from an academic point of view, you can see that there are huge gaps in Africana criminology because of what Maximo Rosso and Carrington and others told you, that criminology had been established as a northern global concern for the metropolitan countries, the industrialized countries, the so-called developed countries, with the exclusion of those who are regarded as southern inhabitants of the hemisphere, people who are regarded as industrializing or developed or underdeveloped countries have not developed criminology with the same passion that the former colonizing powers have been doing. And in my book in 2003, Counter-Colonial Criminology, I raised that issue. Why is there no interest in developing criminology in the former colonial locations in Africa, Asia, and South America? Why were universities in Europe and North America, Australia and New Zealand, of course, settler colonial locations, the ones that we are most interested in developing criminology as a discipline that was exclusive mainly to white men, with women and indigenous scholars excluded from the discourse of criminology? And I answered my question by saying that maybe because criminology was developed as a technology for the control of others, as an imperialist tool for domination, then those countries that emerged from colonialism without any willingness or aim to invade, enslave, or colonize other people may not have interests in developing criminology as a tool for imperialist domination. But that might not be the complete story here. And I'm happy to see that in Asia, in South America, in Africa, beyond the borders of South Africa, another settler colonial location where criminology thrived as a tool of apartheid, we are now beginning to see what Carrington and others have called the Southernizing of criminology, borrowing from the work of Cornell, who had talked about theorization from the South, and from the work of Bonaventura and Walter Mignolo, talking about epistemologies from the South and the decolonial paradigm in almost every field. So that is a comfort to many of us from the South who want to develop criminology, not as a mirror image of what Stan Cohen called made for export criminology. Criminology that was designed simply to be exported to former colonized locations, to teach them the theories and methods that were developed in Western countries where they have failed to guarantee safety, public safety, but they are still presumed to be useful when exported to poorer countries to be used as tools for domination and exploitation of the people by new colonial regimes. If they didn't work in Europe and North America where they were developed, Stan Cohen was asking in Against Criminology, why would made for export criminology work in Africa or South America or in Asia? I concluded that criminology was missing something by excluding the vast majority of the world population from the discipline. Over 85% of the world population live in poorer countries, and they cannot be excluded from any discipline that wishes to thrive as a competitive discipline. So we are doing a favor to criminology by insisting that the discipline needs to be decolonized, just like anthropology scholars are struggling to decolonize anthropology, even economics, history, sociology, political science, the sciences themselves, the STEM disciplines. So criminology cannot be an exception to the world that was made by colonialism, during which criminology emerged. That is something that my professor at Edinburgh University, David Garland, misses when he tells the story or the history of criminology as it emerged from related disciplines. The story of colonialism or imperialism is at the background of all those disciplines developing as tools for social control. That Foucault, even Habermas, wouldn't mention colonialism at all in their theories, in his theory of communicative action or Foucault's theory of discipline and punish. This was a challenge posed to Foucault and Habermas by Edward Said to say that there is no way you can write a history of modern Europe regarding communicative action or the power to discipline and punish without tackling the problem of colonialism and anti-imperialist struggles for decolonization in most parts of the world. The defenders of Habermas, who just rejected a book prize from one of the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. So we commend him on the statement he's making by rejecting the prize. But we shouldn't forget that in his theory of communicative action, he actually said that African systems of communication were pre-literate or pre-civilizational, without realizing that language, human language, originated in Africa. That human civilization originated in Africa. And therefore, African systems of communication cannot be dismissed as pre-civilizational or pre-literate. Africans practically invented the system of writing, according to Derrida. And there is no culture that doesn't have a system of writing, because grammatology, or the science of writing, can be found in all human societies with the ability to give a name to themselves, according to Derrida. And in defense of Foucault, Foucauldians would say that he was writing the history of modern Europe with a small h, not a capital H. But it was said correctly or pointed out that there's no way you can write the history of modern Europe without addressing the injustice done all over the world by European colonizers, especially in Africa. I say especially in Africa because no other continent experienced 400 years of the kidnapping of millions of people to be put to work for hundreds of years without pay as enslaved people, and then colonized for almost another 100 years, subjected to apartheid. The intensification of the violence by Europe against Africa continues under neo-colonial regimes, where the Europeans willingly supply the weapons with which genocidal regimes kill millions of people across Africa. And the question for Oxford University, for Cambridge University, for Harvard, for the top universities in the world is this: you are implicated in these genocidal regimes. Remember, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge leaders were highly educated in France. Same thing with the apartheid judges. They had degrees in law from Oxford and Cambridge, almost all of them. How could they go from studying law in Oxford and Cambridge to administering apartheid without any sense of opposition to the injustice? And they will answer that they are legal positivists who simply apply the law. It's not their job as judges to make law, they would say. But how about us criminologists? Why is it that we as criminologists have excluded from our syllabi the question of genocide? That is called the companion that criminology forgot by Maurice. Why is it that criminologists today, all over the world, when they talk about reparations as a system of justice that is different from incarceration, they never apply that concept of reparations to slavery? Even while people of African descent and the survivors of apartheid and colonialism in Africa are demanding for reparative justice. So that when we come to look at Southernizing criminology or Southern criminology, we need to challenge our colleagues who are making those baby steps, that even Southernizing criminology is in need of further decolonization. So that if you read Rousseau, Sozo, and Carrington's book on Southern criminology, you'll still be surprised to see that they are presenting the people who survived slavery in cities like St. Louis or Baltimore as the most dangerous people in America, most violent, Now that is weird for criminologists to say that people of African descent in America are the most violent people in America. That doesn't even come close to the picture that history teaches us of institutionalized violence, but also massive violence by white supremacists. In other words, if you go to the CDC website, you will see evidence that suggests that African Americans die more from homicide. But when you go beyond the definition of violent death, beyond homicide, and you look at all violent deaths, well, white Americans are the most likely to die from violent deaths. But as Carrington and Sozo and others would say, the white violence in rural white communities especially tends to be hidden from the public, maybe because they are not reported as willful violence. Maybe they are reported only as accidental killing. In Australia, the Southern criminologists would still look at indigenous Australians as the ones who are overrepresented in homicide. Yes, they are overrepresented. But so, I mean, I keep pointing out to my colleagues that part of the reason, and Carrington and Sozo would admit this in their book, is because of institutionalized ways that settler colonialism has dehumanized indigenous people, suggested. But let's not forget that the poor white Australians also catch hell in settler colonialism. For example, 27% of the prisoners in Australia are indigenous people. And that's the highest overrepresentation of any group of people in prison worldwide. But remember that over 70% of the prisoners in Australia are poor whites. If the poor whites knew that, they would come and join indigenous scholars in challenging settler colonialism and the use of criminology as a tool for the domination and oppression of indigenous people, because that oppression also affects poor whites adversely. And that is where my concept of counter-colonial criminology would challenge Southern criminology. Leon Moussaoui made a similar challenge at the University of Liverpool. He's the director of the University of Liverpool program at Singapore, warning Southern criminologists not to use the name change as an opportunity for people of European descent who reside in Southern Hemisphere to claim that they are now exempt from criticism of the colonialist legacies of criminology, simply because they now call themselves Southern criminologists. They need to challenge the fact that even in Southern criminology, indigenous scholars are still marginalized. I thank people like Sozo and Cavalcanti and others for at least citing our work in their own publications. But if you read a lot of Southern criminology, what you find is Europeans, people of European descent who live in the Southern Hemisphere, citing fellow Europeans, and hardly ever did they throw in any scholar of color in their references. Now that's a problem. Not because you're doing a favor to us when you cite us, but because you're missing something when you do not cite us. For example, in Southern criminology, drug trafficking and the drug trade are regarded as criminal activities that escalate violence in the community, instead of demanding for the decolonization of the control of those drugs so that they could be regulated and the harm would be reduced, just like tobacco and alcohol that kill many more people than something like marijuana, for example. So I'm reading the Southern Criminology texts that are published. I haven't come across a single call for the legalization of marijuana, even while people in the streets, in the communities, overwhelmingly demand for that legalization. Uruguay being one of the first to do so in South America, and many cities or states in United States of America doing the same. But in Africa, the neo-colonial regimes continue to implement the laws imposed by colonizers to criminalize Africans for using something like marijuana that has never killed anybody, that doctors want to prescribe for illness. At the same time, tobacco is officially advertised and given subsidies by the neo-colonial regimes, even while tobacco kills 6 million people every year worldwide. And marijuana never killed anybody. Why is it that African regimes are refusing to give African women and men the opportunity to grow and sell marijuana so that they can make legitimate income with which to educate their children and improve their lives? I came across this problem when I was researching Black women and the criminal justice system at Edinburgh University. And I was surprised to find that nearly 90% of Black women in prison in the UK were in prison for drugs offenses. And I said to myself, if it was white people, white women who were being incarcerated in Africa for drugs, the European powers would have gone to war to make sure that those drugs would be made legal. Remember, Britain fought an opium war against China for the right to sell opium to Chinese. Even though the Chinese said, we'll buy your opium and throw them in the sea because we don't want our people addicted. They said, no, that's not enough. We will bring in more opium and we demand the right to sell opium to your people. Now, I'm not saying people should go and do drugs because people in the community have seen the impact of drugs habits on the lives of their loved ones. But we can use education and the healthcare system to treat people who are addicted to drugs. We don't need to send them to prison. In fact, we don't need to kill them the way that the Jamaican police killed over 70 people simply to arrest one drug dealer that the United States of America wanted to be extradited for trial and imprisonment in the US. Okay, if you go to Mexico, you find that in Mexico, the government there, in waging the war against drugs, has managed to escalate the violence. More than 30,000 people have been killed in the drug wars in Mexico and in Philippines. The president of Philippines is hunting down Filipinos and massacring them in their thousands for drugs offenses. All over Southeast Asia, Africans are put to death because they are found with drugs. And no criminologist from Southeast Asia or anywhere in the world has voiced opposition to this outrage. Why would you sentence Africans to death for dealing in drugs? I'm not saying Africans should deal in drugs, but it shouldn't be a death penalty. Since Adam and Eve, if you check, Africans have never executed even a single Asian for any crime. But they chopping off the heads of dozens of Africans every year and harvesting their organs for sale, and no criminologist has raised any questions about this injustice simply for selling drugs. It shouldn't be a death penalty. In fact, it shouldn't be a crime. It should be legalized. So you're not finding this kind of concern in the work of Southern Criminology. Another thing you're not finding very much in the work of Southern criminology is the call for the prison to be abolished. Because we know from indigenous people in New Zealand, in Australia, in Africa, in Asia, in South America, in North America, indigenous people never built even a single prison for tens of thousands of years until they were conquered and colonized. And the colonizers wanted to civilize them by building prisons. Angela Davis and Ruth Gosmore have conclusively argued that since we could live without prisons for thousands of years before we were colonized, we can do it again. We can design a system of justice that doesn't have to rely on mass incarceration and militarized policing the way we know it today. So those are challenges to Southern criminology, that it's not simply a campaign for epistemic justice, the way Santo puts it. Rather, it is a campaign for justice, social justice, for the decolonization of the world, including knowledge, but not just knowledge, especially since what we saw, the lynching of George Floyd before our own very eyes. That kind of thing happens all over the United States and all over the world. It is not something that we can challenge simply through epistemic justice. Santos also talks about epistemicide, the killing of knowledge. But I don't think the knowledge is killed, The knowledge is stolen. And it continues to be stolen, not only in the past. So maybe epistemic piracy is what is going on in many different disciplines, including criminology. Stealing the ideas, but not giving credit to the people who have them. And I hope that Southern criminology will not fall into the same trap of epistemic piracy. Finally, I find in the text Southern Criminology by Sozo and Carrington, they claim that they want to use strategic essentialism to talk about racism in the criminal justice system. Now that is wrong on many grounds, because they are simply saying that there is strategically essentialist way to talk about race as something that exists, whereas we do know that race only exists as the human race. According to a philosopher who was born today, so happy birthday to Karl Marx, he talks about the human race, the human race, the human race, because we are all members of the human race. So a strategic essentialism simply says that, well, there are differences between whites and blacks when it comes to rates of violence in the United States. That is a dangerous step towards admission of racism as part of criminology. So what we should be struggling against in Southern criminology, in counter-colonial criminology, is racism as an ideology, a powerful ideology for domination. So even if there are no biologically existing racial differences, there is racism, and that needs to be combated even within criminology. Paul Gilroy did that with his powerful essay, The Myth of Black Criminality, challenging left realism in the UK, because the left realists started making a similar talk like Southern criminology by saying, yes, it is true that Black youth are more likely to be involved in street crime, and therefore left realism should take crime seriously at the level of poor Black youth. I think Cavalcanti does a similar thing in Brazil when she talks about her family's experience of violent crime. But to be fair to Cavalcanti, she actually talks about the police as the purveyors of this street violence more than the poor indigenous youth who are suspected to be more likely to be violent. So we need to question all those from Southern criminology in order not to make it into another hegemonic denigration of Southerners as being more likely to be violent. On that note, I want to admit that some editors at least are recognizing the huge gap that exists in criminology and when it comes to African criminology. There have been books published in the past on African criminology, but they tend to be more like administrative criminology, talking about prisons and the police and how to control the growing population of young Africans who are restless. But the editors at Routledge invited us, myself and other colleagues, to edit the Routledge Handbook on Africana Criminologies, and we deliberately framed it to be a contribution to critical criminology. The difference between that book and the writings of African criminologists is that most of us African criminologists are conservative in our orientation to criminology. We're not critical enough. So even African criminology deserves or requires to be decolonized more. If you read A Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela, a very revolutionary book that I think should be required reading for all criminologists, you still find Madiba falling into the trap of accepting the idea from Lombroso that some people are born criminals. Mandela actually said that in the book. I don't know how the editors could allow that to escape editorial correction, because Mandela was coming out from prison after 27 years and probably didn't have up-to-date conversation with critical criminology in Africa to that extent. Yes, so we as African scholars are making contributions towards the liberation paradigm in criminology, the decolonization paradigm, and that is different from the decolonial, another phrase that is being coined from South America by Walter Mignolo and others. Decolonial is like an adjective. It is a weak adjective in comparison to the action verb decolonization as a doing word, as an indicator that we are still engaged in struggles on a daily basis. For example, to have African women be given the right to choose reproductive health care instead of subjecting them to criminal punishment for abortion. This is done almost all over Africa under laws that were imposed by colonizers. Long after those colonizers had abolished such laws in their own countries, we're still struggling to win the right to choose, knowing that African women would still choose to have large families if they want, but there is no reason for us to continue to subject them to terror by the state simply because they want to choose reproductive health care. Same thing with the death penalty. We never made laws requiring the death penalty in our indigenous societies. We used reparations to solve even problems like homicide, except in situations of war where people get killed anyway. But long after the Europeans who imposed the death penalty on Africans had abolished the death penalty in their own jurisdiction, we still have the death penalty in Africa today, except maybe in South Africa where Nelson Mandela abolished it, and a few other countries. We still criminalize sex work in Africa. Why? When we don't have any other sources of dignified sources of living for those women, the women who are involved in sex work there, we don't want sewing machines. We want workers' rights. The Sex Workers Association of Nigeria, SWON, said in a public statement. And we know that those jurisdictions that allow sex work to be regulated tend to have less sexually transmitted diseases, because the registered sex workers would then have the incentive to insist on using condoms. They will not be subjected to sex trafficking. Underage children will not be allowed to work in the sex industry. But we still make it a crime across Africa, harassing women. And of course, the drugs offenses have to go, not just road statute. We need to bring down those laws against marijuana across Africa. South Africa has done it when one lawyer, who's a Rasta man, went to the Constitutional Court to say, these apartheid laws deny me my religious rights to use marijuana. And eventually they agreed with him and legalized marijuana, or what they call daga in South Africa. We need to do it across Africa because it could be a source of living, legitimate income to a lot of poor women who have no jobs across Africa. No social security either, no pension. Can you imagine that? No medical care, no national health service across Africa, and they say marijuana could be a drug used to cure a lot of diseases. So there are many more things like that. Yeah, maybe finally, something like homophobia. A lot of scholars in the North are recognizing that there is a lot of homophobia in Africa, but they forget to add in Southern criminology that homophobia was introduced to indigenous people by Europeans. Prior to our colonization, we were not afraid of people who were in love with other consenting adults. It was the Europeans who came with those laws to criminalize same-sex relationships. In Africa today, a woman who doesn't have a child is still allowed to marry another woman to have children. She will be the female husband. We still allow that in Africa, an indication that we are more tolerant of different sexual orientations or sexual identities than the Europeans. And long after the Europeans who imposed homophobia on Africa had abolished such laws in Europe, Africans embraced the homophobic laws as if their lives depended on them. So those are part of the struggles that maybe the decolonization of criminology would help Africans to address, because we have more urgent issues like mass illiteracy, mass poverty, mass illness across Africa to address than waste our time denying the rights of our fellow human beings. I think because of the time we lost to the attackers, maybe I should stop, and then during question and answers, we can cover more of the grounds. Thank you.